Step back in time and witness a story rooted in ancient struggles, a tale of the Amalekites and their enduring conflict with Israel. Do we carry the consequences of these forgotten feuds without even knowing it? Watch as resentment and revenge ripple through generations, shaping destinies and influencing the present. Are we bound to repeat such destructive cycles, or can we find a way to rewrite the script? This journey takes us deep into the heart of a centuries-old enmity, offering a front-row seat to its lessons on forgiveness, obedience, and the weight of choices made long ago. Through this lens, we'll see how an ancient biblical story can shed light on the challenges and conflicts of our own time. Now imagine yourself standing in the arid Negev desert, a barren expanse south of Canaan. The land stretches endlessly, its dunes shifting in the wind, its rocks weathered and scattered like relics of time. This is the domain of the Amalekites, a nomadic people forged by the harshness of this environment. Who were they? To understand, we must trace their lineage back to Amalek, the grandson of Esau. This story begins with a fractured family. Esau, the twin brother of Jacob, lost his birthright and blessing to his sibling. That moment of betrayal planted the seeds of resentment that would grow into generations of animosity. Can you picture Esau's bitterness, his sense of injustice, as he watched his legacy slip away? That pain did not fade with time. It was carried forward to his descendants, including Amalek, and so the ancient feud between Jacob and Esau lived on, reborn in the enmity between the Amalekites and the Israelites. We are invited to ponder, how often do the disputes we leave unresolved become burdens for those who come after us? Is it possible that we are unknowingly bearing the weight of ancient resentments? The Bible first mentions the Amalekites in Genesis 14:7. Then they returned and came to En-Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the Amalekites and also the Amorites who lived in Hazezon Tamar. This brief reference hints at the age and importance of the Amalekites in the biblical world. The Amalekites lived as nomads, moving across a vast expanse from Havilah to Shur, near Egypt. Imagine their camel caravans crossing the dunes, their tents rising and falling with the seasons. This was a people in constant motion, adapting to the challenges of an unforgiving desert landscape. This historical and geographical context provides the setting for one of the longest-running conflicts in biblical history. The Amalekites, born from Esau's line, and the Israelites, descendants of Jacob, seemed fated to clash, altering the trajectory of both nations. The Sinai Desert stretches endlessly, its silence broken only by the shuffling steps of the weary Israelites. Freed from Egypt, they journey toward a land promised but not yet seen. Then, like a shadow over their hope, Amalek strikes. In the blistering heat, the Amalekites, desert veterans, emerge as a fearsome force. Their sudden assault disrupts the camp, throwing the Israelites into chaos. Moses rises to the moment, rallying his people. He instructs Joshua, "Lead the men into battle." With Aaron and Hur by his side, Moses ascends a nearby hill, holding the staff of God aloft. What happens next becomes the stuff of legend. The battle below surges and retreats in rhythm with Moses' raised arms. The moment his hands drop, Amalek's forces surge forward. It is a fight not just of swords, but of endurance and faith. As the day stretches on, Moses' strength wanes, but Aaron and Hur are at his side. They lift his arms high, steadying him in the fading light. Below, the valley roars with the clash of battle, but above, a quiet triumph takes shape. Moses, his arms held firm by his companions, becomes a living symbol of perseverance and divine power. By sunset, the Israelites prevail, their victory etched into the sands of history. This passage brims with symbolic meaning. Moses' uplifted hands serve as a vivid illustration of Israel's dependence on God, reminding us that neither physical nor spiritual battles are won by human strength alone, but through divine providence. As the account concludes, Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. The victory secured Israel's safety, yet it also marked the beginning of a prolonged enmity between the two nations. Such a moment invites introspection. How do we handle injustice in our lives? Do we rely on our own abilities, or do we place our trust in God? And how does the support of those who stand with us influence the battles we face? The victory at Rephidim may have silenced the Amalekites for a time, but the echoes of their cruelty would linger, setting the stage for a bitter enmity. Deuteronomy 25:17-19 reveals the depth of their crime and God's response. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you were coming out of Egypt, how he attacked your rear ranks, all the stragglers at your rear when you were tired and weary, and he did not fear God. Picture the caravan of Israel trudging through the desert, their spirits lifted by freedom, yet weighed down by exhaustion. Without warning, Amalek descends like a predator. The defenseless at the rear, those too weak to keep pace, are slaughtered, their cries lost in the dry desert winds. God's command to erase Amalek's memory is shocking in its finality, yet it speaks to the gravity of their sin. This was not just an act of violence, it was an affront to the God who had performed miracles for Israel. The Amalekites' defiance went beyond cruelty. It became a symbol of resistance to divine justice. This dramatic moment compels us to consider, what threats in our own lives mirror Amalek's defiance? What must we confront and remove to align ourselves with God's purpose? The scene also reminds us of the sacred responsibility to protect and uplift the weak, ensuring that no one is left vulnerable. As the biblical narrative unfolds, the conflict between the Amalekites and the Israelites escalates into a relentless saga of war and enmity. The Amalekites, relentless in their hostility, do not fight alone. Instead, they forge alliances with Israel's enemies, intensifying the threat. In Judges 3:13 we read, "Then he gathered to himself the people of Ammon and Amalek, went and defeated Israel, and took possession of the city of palms." Picture the scene. The forces of Moab, Ammon, and Amalek, united in a powerful coalition marching upon Israel. For 18 long years, Eglon of Moab, with the Amalekites at his side, crushed Israel under his oppressive rule. Imagine the despair and helplessness of the Israelites, watching their ancient enemies now allied with others, multiplying the strength of their opposition. The Amalekites, a long-standing symbol of defiance against God's plan, once again proved themselves a formidable and persistent foe. Later, in Judges 6:3-5, the Amalekites appear again, this time allied with the Midianites. Whenever Israel had sown, the Midianites, Amalekites, and people of the east would come up and destroy the produce of the earth. They came as numerous as locusts, with their camels beyond number, devastating the land. Picture Israel's fields laid bare, their hard-earned harvest trampled underfoot, their herds driven away. The land lies desolate, the people starving as their enemies swarm like an unstoppable plague. The Amalekites once again embodied devastation and chaos, driving the Israelites to cry out to God for deliverance. The terror of these attacks comes alive in this vivid portrayal. The Amalekites and their allies surged through the land like a swarm of locusts, devastating everything in their path. Their cruelty went beyond war. They aimed to crush Israel's livelihood by destroying crops and plundering livestock, leaving the people in despair. In this grim reality, God raised Gideon as a judge to bring deliverance. Gideon's triumph in the valley of Jezreel against the combined forces of the Midianites and Amalekites is a resounding example of God's power to save his people, no matter how hopeless the situation appears. These stories hold timeless lessons. First, they remind us that the enemies of God often work together to oppose his people. In our spiritual journey, we may feel as if our trials and temptations are conspiring against us. Second, the Amalekites' persistence warns us that some battles are not resolved in a single victory. Spiritual warfare often requires endurance and readiness for future challenges. Finally, Gideon's story reassures us that God's deliverance is always within reach. Even when the odds feel overwhelming, his plan for victory remains steadfast. Reflect on this. What alliances of challenges or temptations do we face today? How can we find the faith of Gideon to trust God amid seemingly insurmountable opposition? We now arrive at one of the most dramatic and consequential episodes in the history of the Amalekites, their confrontation with Saul, the first king of Israel. This event, recorded in 1 Samuel 15, presents a gripping drama of obedience, disobedience, and the far-reaching consequences of defying God's command. The chapter opens with a stark directive from God, delivered through the prophet Samuel. Go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. 1 Samuel 15:3. This command might shock our modern sensibilities. However, it must be understood within the context of Old Testament holy war, where certain nations were deemed irredeemably corrupt and a direct threat to God's plan for his people. Saul gathers his army and sets out against the Amalekites. The battle is fierce, and the Israelites emerge victorious. But this is where the story takes a pivotal turn. Verse 9 states, "But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them. But everything despised and worthless they utterly destroyed." Imagine the scene. Saul, triumphant on the battlefield, surrounded by the spoils of war. The allure of wealth and prestige is before him. Perhaps he believes sparing King Agag was an act of mercy or a strategic move to secure political advantage. Whatever his reasoning, Saul chose to disobey God's explicit command. This act of disobedience had immediate and far-reaching repercussions. Informed by God, Samuel set out to confront the king. What followed was a heart-wrenching exchange. "What is this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen which I hear?" Samuel asks. Saul, eager to justify himself, replies, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God. But the rest we have utterly destroyed." Samuel's response is unwavering and delivers a timeless lesson. Does the Lord delight as much in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. This passage teaches us a fundamental truth about obedience to God. It is not about blindly following rules, but about trusting his wisdom and plan, even when we cannot fully understand his reasons. Saul's disobedience carries severe consequences. Samuel declares, "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also has rejected you from being king." This marks the beginning of the end of Saul's reign. The chapter concludes with Samuel personally executing King Agag, fulfilling God's original command. This action underscores the seriousness with which God views disobedience and the importance of fulfilling his word. This episode invites deep reflection. In what areas of our lives are we tempted to spare Agag, to partially obey God while justifying our actions with good intentions? How can we cultivate a more complete and trusting obedience in our walk with God? The narrative now shifts to one of the most dramatic episodes in David's journey to kingship, his encounter with the Amalekites, found in 1 Samuel 30. This moment provides a powerful illustration of faith under pressure, decisive leadership, and God's faithfulness in times of crisis. The tragedy unfolds as David and his men return to Ziklag, only to find it devastated. The text recounts, "When David and his men reached Ziklag, they discovered it burned with fire, and their wives and children had been taken captive." 1 Samuel 33. The scene is heart-wrenching. Warriors who had faced countless battles are brought to their knees by the sight of their ruined homes. They wept until they had no strength left to weep, verse 4, the Bible says. As grief turns to anger, David becomes the target of blame, with his men contemplating stoning him. But David's response is remarkable. Instead of crumbling under the weight of the moment, David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Verse 6. This act of turning to God rather than despair becomes the foundation of his next steps. Seeking divine direction through the ephod, David asks if he should pursue the Amalekites. God's answer is a promise of victory. Pursue them. You will surely overtake them and rescue the captives. Verse 8. What follows is an intense chase through the wilderness. An abandoned Egyptian slave, left for dead by the Amalekites, becomes the key to locating the enemy's camp. There, David and his men find the Amalekites celebrating, feasting on their plunder in careless revelry. David's attack is swift and decisive. David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day. None escaped except 400 young men who fled on camels. Verse 17. The victory is absolute, and David recovers everything the Amalekites had taken, including his own family. This story reminds us of the importance of turning to God in times of crisis. David's refusal to act on impulse, instead seeking God's guidance, is a lesson in faith and reliance on divine wisdom. Secondly, this episode teaches us the value of steadfast leadership in times of adversity. Even when faced with the threat of rebellion from his men, David maintains his composure, demonstrating wisdom and strength under pressure. Additionally, this chapter reveals a defining trait of David, his generosity. When some of his men insist on withholding the spoils of victory from those who stayed behind, David responds with remarkable fairness. No, my brothers, that is not what we should do with what the Lord has given us. The share of the one who fought in the battle will be the same as the share of the one who stayed with the supplies. They will share alike. 1 Samuel 30:23-24. This decision, which becomes a law in Israel, reflects David's ability to turn a moment of division into a legacy of justice. It exemplifies how leadership rooted in fairness and gratitude to God can create principles that endure. Let's take a moment to consider, how do we handle challenges during a crisis? Do we turn to God for direction? How can we embody fairness and generosity in our leadership and daily actions? Reflecting on the Amalekites, we see a people whose history is deeply intertwined with that of Israel over the centuries. Their final chapter in the Bible prompts us to consider the far-reaching consequences of enmity and the importance of faithfulness to God. The last significant mention of the Amalekites appears in 1 Chronicles 4:42-43, and 500 of them, of the sons of Simeon, went to Mount Seir, with captains Pelatiah, Neariah, Rephaiah, and Uzziel, the sons of Ishi, and they struck the remnant of the Amalekites who had escaped. They have dwelt there to this day. This brief but significant passage recounts the final fulfillment of God's judgment against the Amalekites, Picture the scene. A group of Simeonites, likely seeking to expand their territory, comes across the last remnants of the Amalekites in Mount Seir. The ensuing battle marks the end of a once powerful people. Notably, this event occurs during the reign of King Hezekiah, centuries after the Amalekites first clashed with Israel in the wilderness. This timeline underscores the enduring nature of their enmity and reveals how the consequences of actions and decisions can ripple across generations. The statement, "They have dwelt there to this day," holds particular significance. For the author of Chronicles, the elimination of the Amalekites and the Simeonites' occupation of their land signified a decisive and lasting event. It marked the final chapter for the Amalekites as a national identity in the biblical story. What adds an air of mystery to their narrative is the absence of any archaeological or historical evidence of the Amalekites outside the Bible. This has led some to question their historical reality, while others propose that they may have been recorded under another name in external records. This absence challenges us to think about the nature of memory and the role of storytelling in shaping historical understanding. For the biblical authors, the Amalekites were more than just a historical people. They were a symbol of defiance against God's will and a call to remain faithful. The story of the Amalekites imparts vital lessons. 1. Our choices and actions have the power to influence future generations. 2. Trusting and obeying God is essential, even when His purposes are unclear. 3. God's promises are certain, whether they bring blessings or justice, even if their fulfillment takes time. 4. Breaking cycles of animosity and working toward reconciliation is essential to end generational conflicts. Reflect on this. What unresolved Amalekites persist in your life or society? How can we, as individuals and communities, commit to breaking these cycles and fostering justice and mercy in our relationships? The story of the Amalekites offers a timeless lesson, one that resonates far beyond its ancient setting into the complexities of our modern age. From the origins of a bitter family rivalry to its dramatic culmination centuries later, we've observed epic battles, critical decisions, and the enduring consequences of both disobedience and faithfulness. This narrative pushes us to ask ourselves, are we sustaining cycles of enmity that need to end? When faced with injustice or opposition, how do we respond? Do we rely on God's guidance, especially in moments of crisis? Far more than a historical account, the story invites us to a profound spiritual examination. It underscores that our actions have lasting consequences, that obedience to God's will is paramount, and that even in the face of conflict, God is actively fulfilling His divine purposes. In today's world, where ancient grievances still echo and new hostilities threaten to divide us, the story of the Amalekites calls us to a higher standard. It challenges us to break the cycle of retaliation, pursue reconciliation wherever possible, and place our trust in God's unerring justice and mercy. I encourage you to reflect. What part of this story resonates most with you? How can you incorporate these lessons into your life, your relationships, and your role in your community? If you found this exploration of biblical history enriching, I invite you to share it with others. By learning from these ancient accounts, we can find guidance to navigate the trials we face in our world today. Have you ever felt like you're wrestling with unseen forces, grappling with challenges that seem impossible to overcome? Like the Israelites facing the Amalekites, you might feel locked in a struggle with no end in sight. What can these ancient tales teach you about resilience and faith? Don't miss our next video, where we'll uncover how the Israelites confronted the Canaanites and explore what these battles reveal about the challenges we face today. Subscribe and embark on this journey with us. May God's blessings be with you.